The final chapter of the final chapter of the book, chapter 23, is called Goodbyes. It took Elmswood quite a bit of time to fully recover from the town fair. Photographs of the shocked Prime Minister beside Mr. Torrance's bare bottom made it onto the front page of almost every national newspaper, and filmed footage of the incident appeared on comedy TV shows across the world. Needless to say, the national media decided to stay put in Elmswood for a little bit longer than originally intended. Journalists and news reporters were desperate to find out the story behind the photo, so for a good few days it was tricky for residents to go about their day-to-day business without being bombarded with interview requests or being asked for juicy gossip about the man bearing his behind. The project members were initially stunned by the publicity. They never imagined exposure on this scale and were initially thrilled to see Mr. Torrance and the Prime Minister humiliated the way they were. Their triumphant moods became somewhat short-lived, however, when they began to examine the newspapers in more detail. Yes, the photo of Mr. Torrance had stolen the front pages, but where was the reporting on the amazing feat David had managed to pull off? The children searched through the papers as thoroughly as they could, and eventually they found a couple of brief mentions buried deep in the broadsheets. But other than that, nothing. It seemed that the press had more of an appetite for scandal than it had for justice. David's takedown of the Prime Minister had gone almost completely unreported. And so in the weeks that followed the fair, the fate of the ARC project's two targets began to take shape. Whilst Mr. Torrance had managed to outmaneuver what the project had originally planned for him, his ultimate humiliation was on a scale none of them could have predicted. Like most people probably would do in his position, he stayed hidden inside his house for the days that followed the town fair. It didn't take long, though, for somebody to tip the media off to where he lived, for soon enough Mr. Torrance found several photographers and journalists camped outside his front garden. Having the breathing space of the school holidays just around the corner, Mr. Torrance took the decision to get out of town altogether until the heat died down. He had relatives down south to stay with, and when he saw a local teaching job being advertised, he decided to make the move permanent. To the delight of all the project members, Mr. Torrance would never set foot in Elmswood High again. In many ways, and although he would probably never see it this way, Alfred Thorpe's career was saved by that photograph with Mr. Torrance, for it stole the news and diverted attention from his debate with David. With Prime Minister's leadership already in the ropes, it was quite conceivable that being unable to hold his own against a teenager may have been the final straw. At the very least, it would have seriously called into question his government's decision to scrap the youth card. In the end, the Prime Minister managed to survive the aftermath of the town fair rather well. Yes, he had to put up with his fair share of embarrassment once photos were in circulation. But as a man whose whole life was in the public eye, he was well aware that one embarrassment is quickly replaced by the next one. The public would quickly forget. The Prime Minister was hugely grateful that coverage of his interaction with David didn't become more widespread, and without any serious contention to a scrapping of the scheme, the government was able to cease the youth card at the end of the summer. "I don't know where we're going to put all this stuff," said Chris as he lifted the second of the two notice boards off the headquarters wall. "I don't suppose it matters," shrugged Trevor. "Take them to a charity shop or something. It's not like we're going to need them anymore." David, Chris and Trevor had been dreading this day for most of the summer. When it became clear that the Prime Minister wasn't going to back down on plans to scrap the youth card, the bus companies started to make their redundancies. Kazima's mum was one of many drivers to lose her job. She had no choice but to seek work in one of the bigger cities far away from Elmswood. Kazima had, of course, already made it clear that she was finished with the ARC project, but in the backs of their minds, all the other members secretly hoped that she'd be back on board once all the fuss about the Jessop's farm had died down. This move, though, this felt real. When they heard the news, David, Chris and Trevor met to discuss next steps. All three agreed that the project shouldn't continue without her. And besides, with Mr. Torrance finally taken care of, who was left for them to target? They decided to clear out the headquarters to send a strong message to Kazima when they met for their goodbyes, that without her, there was no ARC project. And so the three boys had worked hard to clear the space of all their work, all their memories. With nowhere left to sit, everybody was standing when they heard Kazima enter a code for what would be the last time. "Wow, you guys have certainly not wasted any time," said Kazima, her eyes wandering the room. "It's good to see you, Kazima," said David. "How are you feeling?" "Pretty rotten, as you would expect," she replied. "But you know, I've been through all this before and gotten through it. I'll survive." As glad as they were to all be seeing Kazima again, there was an awkward atmosphere in the air. With the exception of David's chat throughout the fair, it had been a good few months since any of the boys had spoken to Kazima, and everybody seemed a bit lost for words, the way good friends often can be when they haven't seen each other in a while. I'm surprised you haven't wrote Becky in as my replacement, Kazima eventually said after what seemed like a long silence. I saw you all speaking together at the fair, you know. Could hardly believe my eyes. We needed her help with Mr. Torrance, said Trevor. She helped us once and that was it. There's more to her than meets the eye, though, chipped in Chris. She's actually all right once you get to know her. And you know as well as we do, Kazima, that you wouldn't be replaced easily, said David. Arc is done. We've achieved all we needed to, and it wouldn't have been possible without you. At this point, Trevor quickly scurried away to retrieve something that was propped up against the back wall of the room. We made you this as a way of saying thank you and to help you remember us all, he said, eyes beginning to moisten as he handed Kazima a large brown book. Kazima took the book, surprised by the gesture, and started to leaf through the pages. It was a meticulously crafted scrapbook made up of all the target photos that had previously adorned the notice boards. Alongside the photos, the boys had written their memories of each of the missions, and there also featured some of Trevor's hand-drawn maps, as well as press clippings from the incident at the bakery. Kazima closed the book, fighting to hold back the tears. She read the title on the front, The Ark Project, and realised then how much she would truly miss them all. I can't think of this as being goodbye, Kazima said. We will see each other soon. We have to. And remember this. Even though I'll be 300 miles away, if you guys ever need my help, I'll always find a way. Kazima hugged and thanked each of the three boys in turn before turning to the door to leave. Good luck, David called after her, already feeling a loss that he was unable to put into words. As she reached the doorway, Kazima turned in the boy's direction one final time. She reached into her hair and pulled out a pencil she'd been using as a makeshift hairpin and threw it. The boys turned abruptly as it span over the tops of their heads, making its way to the opposite side of the room, where it hit a mouldy peach which had been left neglected on the windowsill, piercing its skin and causing it to splat on the floor. Kazima smiled, gave the boys a final wave, and then she was gone. That's the end of the Ark project. If you've been watching this all, thank you very much. Or if you've been reading the book, thanks as well. Hopefully you'll hear from me again soon with something new. But in the meantime, thanks again, and goodbye.